Welcome to a screencast about the homework, questions and readings for the Revolution of 1905. So here you can see two pictures. One is of Bloody Sunday and the other is of the Japanese victory in one of the battles of the Russo-Japanese War. What we're going to look at is how these two events led to the Revolution in 1905, and also why did the revolution fail. The homework questions will be questions 1 to 4 on page 16 and questions 2 to 4 on page 17. Now let's take a look at the readings. So as you can see, the title is The Revolution of 1905, and why was there a revolution and why did it fail? What the revolution looked like was the work stopped everywhere, on the railways and in all the factories, workshops, and shops of all types. The whole population was on the streets. People began to ransack arms, stores, and smash windows of large shops. Students, directed by lawyers, doctors, and teachers, set up barricades. And this was a consistent outcome. The railways were on strike. Almost all traffic in the streets had been stopped. Street lighting was no more. The inhabitants of St. Petersburg feared to go out in the streets at night. And this was in October of 1905. And it shows that in 1905, the Tsar's government had lost control of the country. There was a national strike involving 2.5 million people. And what were the events that had triggered the revolution in 1905? It was the disastrous war against Japan and the massacre of Bloody Sunday, which happened on January 22nd, 1905. And I should repeat, there are two events that triggered the war. The disastrous war against Japan and the massacre of Bloody Sunday on January 22nd, 1905. And you'll notice here that it was October 1905 that the revolution began, but the events that started, of course, preceded it. First of all, let's look at the war with Japan. And we can see the war with Japan lasted from 1904 to 1905. And at the beginning of Tsar Nicholas's reign, Japan had captured Port Arthur from China. However, Russia wanted this ice-free port for use in her own Pacific Navy. And the Russians assumed they would easily defeat Japan, a small country which they believed was very backward and no match for a great empire like Russia. In fact, this was a cartoon they made where the Russian Navy is punching and destroying the Japanese Navy. The opposite is actually what occurred. In fact, the war turned into a national humiliation for the Russians. And in addition, the importance of the war with Japan was that it convinced many people that change was necessary. The Tsar and his ministers were leading the country to disaster. Now, Bloody Sunday. Here you can see the workers walking in protest. Father Gapon in the beginning. They're carrying an icon of the Tsar, and they're actually singing hymns. And they were going to speak to the Tsar in St. Petersburg, the capital, on the 22nd of January, 1905, on a Sunday. Within 1 month of the defeat of Port Arthur on January 22nd, 1905, protesters gathered in the Russian capital, St. Petersburg. They were led by a priest, Father Gapon. Their aim was to march to the Winter Palace and present a petition to the Tsar. The petition explained that the people are approaching the terrible moment when the death is better than continuing to live with these intolerable sufferings. There are food shortages and shortages of all sorts of materials in Russia and in the cities in particular. They said that we have no human rights, not even the right of discussing our needs. However, the Tsar was not in the Winter Palace, but the protesters did not know this. They, in many cases, thought that the Tsar just didn't know what was occurring and that he would help them out if they went. Instead, they were met by armed guards and fired upon. The events of the 22nd of January became known as Bloody Sunday. The Russian government claimed that 96 people had killed and 333 injured. However, the numbers were much higher, and some think as many as 1,000. Now, the revolution. On February 1905, the Tsar's uncle, the Grand Duke, was assassinated. Strikes and riots spread across Russia. In Odessa, there was a mutiny on board the battleship Potemkin, and this meant the armed forces might be close to not supporting the Tsar. If the mutiny had spread to the army, the Tsar would have had no troops to put down the revolt. That's very important. And so in October, when the general strike, described in sources A and B on the pages before, began to paralyze the country. The Tsar was terrified, as were many people in Russia. Now, before we look at the organization of the strikes in St. Petersburg and who is carrying that out, we need to show you the questions you're doing. Here we have question 1, question 2, question 3, and question 4. Question 4 asks you about sources. Question 3, which source does support what is shown in source F? And then finally, source F is a painting. What differences can you find between the story it tells and that shown in source E? Now, who was organizing those strikes? It was the Social Revolutionaries, the Mensheviks, and the Bolsheviks. These two groups you'd know as the Communists. So, the Communists for these groups. They all realized the importance of this power and got their members elected to the Executive Committee of the Soviet. The chairman of the Soviet was Leon Trotsky. Following the success at St. Petersburg Soviet, Soviets appeared in many other cities as well. The Tsar's chief minister, Witt, convinced the Tsar that the only way to end the crisis was to give into the demands of the rebels. On the third day of the strike, the Tsar issued the October Manifesto, which promised freedom of speech and belief as well as a parliament, or a Duma. These promises won the support of the middle classes. Many of them had been very frightened by the violence of the workers, and they wanted to see an end to the revolution. So the people opposing the Tsar were the nobles, who wanted him to rule better, the middle class, who thought they could rule better, the workers, who wanted a better deal, the peasants, who were angry about the land problems and the shortages, and some of the military. With the October Manifesto, the nobles were taken out, the middle class were removed, the peasants would be removed by offering them an end to those redemption payments they had earned, and then finally that left just the workers. In terms of the military, the war was over and his loyal military came back. And in November, the Tsar announced the end of the redemption payments in order to pacify the peasants. These were those heavy payments that they had to pay to end serfdom. This meant the industrial workers were isolated as the only group whose demands had not been met. One of their leaders was Leon Trotsky, who we'll see later in the 1917 revolution. So, their revolts, the workers, such as a general strike in Moscow in December 1905, were crushed with great brutality by the troops which had returned from the war with Japan. The revolution was over. This revolution had not been organized to overthrow the Tsar. Instead, it had been a series of unconnected and scattered outbursts of violence and protest amongst the industrial workers and peasants. In January 1905, most of the main revolutionary leaders, such as Lenin, were not even in the country. They were taken by surprise by the events. Also, most of the army remained loyal, so that the later riots could be crushed. So, when you're doing your questions, which are here, you can see there's question number 2. Make a list of as many causes you can for the 1905 revolution. Which were the long-term causes? Which were the short-term causes? You might want to look at Waller and the Russian history for that. In addition, look at the following list of reasons for the failure of the 1905 revolution. You're going to make 2 columns, strengths of the Tsarism and 1 weakness of the opposition, and then sort these items there. And then finally, look at your completed table and explain in a couple sentences whether you feel it's true to say that the failure of the 1905 revolution was due to the strength of the Tsarist government. So that's the homework and the other materials for the 1905 revolution.